I think since we are 5 minutes over, we can let Jason join. Why don't we start? Abby and Justin, really excited to welcome you to this session of Unpacking Open Source. And when Jason comes in, we'll introduce him as well. But I'll request both of you to at least start with introducing yourselves. Maybe talk a bit about your backgrounds, your journey to your current companies, and your role at your current companies. And then we can dig in from there.
Sure. Abby, you want to go first?
Happy to. So thank you so much for having me, Apurva. It's my favorite topic, talking about open source. So today I am the CTO at Puppet. And prior to that, I spent 4.5 years as CEO of Cloud Foundry Foundation, the open source home of Cloud Foundry. But I've been in tech 20 years and all of it enterprise infrastructure, and that's sort of my jam. So this is a fantastic opportunity to talk about my favorite things, enterprise infrastructure and open source.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm Justin Borgman, co-founder and CEO of Starburst. Starburst is the company behind an open source project called Presto. I'll make my shameless plug now. If you'd like a free copy of the O'Reilly book, we're giving them away on top of our website, starburstdata.com. But I've been doing this for basically, I guess, 10 years specifically in the data space, going all the way back to 2010. My first company was called Hadapt. That was an early SQL engine for Hadoop. That was acquired by Teradata. And then while I was at Teradata, basically met three guys, Martin, Dane, and David, who had created Presto at Facebook. And that began a collaboration. And ultimately, in 2017, we decided to form Starburst as the commercial entity effectively supporting the project.
Awesome.
Fascinating journey. And while we are waiting for Jason, I think one more thing that we might want to cover, Abby and Jason, like how have these roles for you kind of changed in the last 8 to 9 months, given the pandemic and given COVID? Abby, why don't you go first, and then Justin, you after that?
Well, I had the unique opportunity of starting Puppet in the pandemic. I started in Puppet 8 months ago, so we were well in the, for those of you in the Bay Area, we were well in the shelter in place. So you know, it's been a little bit of a struggle, because at the end of the day, I started a new company and met a highly distributed team, and some of which I've never met in person before. So I've spent a lot more time on Zoom than I ever have before ever in my life. But it's also proven to me that one, you can build those connections and you can get a team aligned virtually on Zoom, which is great, because I feel like that also opens an opportunity for us to think a little more broadly about our pipeline and hiring and who we can hire and where we can really build the team, and that you can do so outside of a core base and a core office experience. And so I feel like there's a lot of goodness that has come from this enforced remoteness. And, you know, there's a lot of challenges with this, obviously, and I speak from an immense position of privilege in that I have a home office and I have space and opportunity. But it's also really, hopefully for us as an industry, also said, hey, you know what, we can hire people remotely and we can still build that team and we can be successful.
Yep. Justin, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, in our case, this has been a year of really scaling up the business. We had started as a bootstrap company the first couple of years, then raised venture capital. And so, you know, a year ago, we were probably 45 people as a business, and now we're 200. And what that means is that more than half the company I've never actually met in person, right? I mean, I can totally relate to Abby's story, because it's got to be weird. Maybe you've never even been in the office. I don't know, Abby, have you?
Yeah, I went to the office, but like twice.
Okay, yeah, like twice, right? So it sort of changes everything in terms of how you form those relationships and get to know people. And in particular, I think in our case, like, how do you enable them? How do you onboard them and get them educated on what you do? And in our case, a lot of that growth has been sales growth. So we've had to train sales reps without me being able to spend time with them in the field, you know, working with customers. So it's been a challenge, but I think we maybe are stronger for it. I think we've learned a lot of techniques to sort of cope with it, and that's made us maybe more effective as a distributed organization.
and I'll definitely dig in and ask you specific questions around that when we talk about execution. But without delaying any further, I'll start with a quick perspective around open source, and then would love to ask some questions around those things. I think when we think about open source, we think about essentially three categories of open source companies, and I might be oversimplifying it, right? One is where some developers and enthusiasts end up creating a piece of software that they love, and then not necessarily for a business purpose, but then they end up creating a business model around it once it gains some kind of traction and momentum and popularity. The second category is those where you're a team in a big tech company or an enterprise where you're creating a piece of software as a byproduct. And then you're open sourcing it for the benefit of the community. And the creators of that open source product kind of commercialize it. Confluent being an example. There are many such examples in the industry. And the third category being startups that are built ground up on a product-led go-to-market model where you're essentially open source to get developer adoption, demonstrate value before you kind of build the enterprise features on top of that. And I'm assuming that there are folks in the audience today which come from different kinds of these dimensions as well and categories as well. So just now, I'll kick off the discussion with you. Starburst has followed a pretty unique path and doesn't fit into any of these categories that I just described. Presto started as a small project, as you described, in Facebook, and it was pressure tested in a big tech company. And then at Teradata, you were able to deploy R&D dollars towards it, and also find use cases. How did you further grow and build on the existing community, which might have been seeded by Facebook with contributions from Airbnb and Netflix early on?
Yeah, I think it is maybe a little unique because it all happened over a very long period of time. Like Presto itself is 8 years old, and I think sometimes people forget that just because it's become significantly more popular recently. But I think in 2012 it was maybe category 2 there, as you were describing. Facebook creates great technology as a byproduct of the business, and in this case they open sourced it. But I think what helped it accelerate was obviously us getting involved in 2014 or 2015 after the acquisition of my first business, and really being able to kind of take a enterprise focused lens to the project early and kind of make it more useful to a broader audience of not just hyperscale Silicon Valley companies. And so that began a collaboration, as you mentioned. R&D dollars were invested, and Presto just kind of slowly got better and better. And I think because there was no company behind Presto up to that point, it kind of grew under the radar. I think a lot of people didn't realize that more and more people were actually deploying this as the technology kind of matured. And then that culminated with ultimately, obviously, starting Starburst, and now, I guess now we're in kind of scaling mode. But yeah, it's been a long journey, and I couldn't say that we planned it this way. I think sometimes we should never underestimate the importance of luck along the way.
Yeah, totally. And I think just to add to that question over there, right? Even though it existed for a while, there would have been a lot of effort from the point of view of developer advocacy, marketing, and other kinds of avenues to grow this community. Could you touch a bit about those kind of initiatives from your side just to grow this community for people who are trying to grow communities as open source companies?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I'll say that I will speak on behalf of my co-founders who really did the early work of building the community, and I think it helps that they were at Facebook by virtue of just Facebook being a cool, innovative company, and I think it lent some attention to the project early on, and they could then go speak to their peers at companies like Netflix and Uber and Airbnb and LinkedIn and create other early adopters who were similarly lighthouses within their own industries for deploying data technologies. And so I think that created some very visible users of the technology, which just lent credibility to what it could do. And I think by virtue of being proven at scale from day one, that was helpful. And I think from there, it's really just trying to engage with people. I think for us, the Slack channel is probably the most interactive way that we interact with our community. The Presto SQL Slack channel, I think, has I don't know, a couple thousand, active users or something like that. Martine would know the exact number, but it's a place where, people can ask their questions, get answers from other big users, and really have that dialogue and feel the impact of the community. Another thing we did was a lot of events in the early days. We called them Presto Summits, and we would bring everybody all together and host it in a different, location every time. And I think that was also a good community building activity. And I think, again, I would just remind people also that this takes time. It's not something you can kind of create the community overnight. Like it's a multi-year journey.
And Jason, welcome. You came in at the right time for the first question that we were like circulating around with. But before we do that, it would be helpful to kind of quickly start with your introduction and quick background that everyone covered earlier. And then I think the question, which I would love to get your thoughts on, as soon as you finish your background, is around like seeding and growing communities. And I think specifically for you, a ton of open source development happens on GitHub, and obviously distributed from there as well. And you're in the midst of all the action for open source. So we'd love to get your thoughts on like how developer empathetic teams are seeding and growing communities as you see it.
Sure, great, thank you. And hi everybody. Glad to be here. I'm Jason Warner. I'm the CTO at GitHub. Prior to GitHub, I was the head of engineering, VP of engineering for Heroku for 3 years. And then before Heroku, I was head of engineering for Canonical, people who make Ubuntu Linux. So effectively, I ran Ubuntu for 5 years. So my background is essentially the last 10 years or so has been developers, platforms, and public clouds, and how they all kind of meet together. And in the last nearly 4 years at GitHub, obviously the way that we engage with developers is very different. We have a direct relationship with developers when it comes to the product we offer, but also the fact that it is the home for nearly all of open source in the world these days. Open source does happen on GitHub, so we have to have a very different relationship with the developers themselves, as well as the communities and the open source world. Specific to the question you asked, Purva, I think that it's not unlike, I don't want to say this to developers directly, and I know there are developers listening, but if you want to engage with developers, it's not unlike sales or classic sales or marketing, and to some degree. You have to understand why they're even coming to you in the first place and why they would find value in what you do. So if you're a corporation, you want to develop community because it's part of your overall strategy or go-to-market, or you think it's very important for your product line to have community, don't think of them as marketing funnels, think of them as sales funnels that you want to engage with, but you're not selling to them. You're trying to show them value and what value that is. And it's very different. One of the big things that I try to reinforce for my role, and my specific role at GitHub, is that there's no one type of developer, and there's no one type of developer community around the world. So they have very different needs, wants, hopes, dreams, engagement models. So as an example, like with Linux, the Linux community engages very differently than the JavaScript community. At the end of the day, while they're developers, and maybe VCs would think of them as developers, you have to think about and understand what the principles and values of that community are, and how they might be very, very, very different from each other. And that is where you would take some lessons from sales. You don't sell to the Oracle contingent the same way you would sell to the GitHub Stripes of the world contingent. One last thing I'll say, I don't want to monopolize the time, but I do think that know your customer is a very important thing. Know your community, know your developers is very, very important here, because you can lose trust faster with these folks than you can with classic sales channels. If your values and principles aren't aligned with the community and you have some sort of disagreement over something, it's actually harder to get that back than a classic economic relationship, because trust relationships are much, much harder to rebuild.
That's a great point, Jason. And having a takeaway being have the empathy for the audience that you're selling to, but at the same time, understand the value that you're creating for them, but also knowing exactly who is in that community, who is seeing value from you. And I think moving to Abby, Abby, you've spoken a lot about activating different stakeholders in the community, from code committers to users, like software vendors and integrators to build like meaningful user engagement. And you've written extensively about that. But this ends up being a black box for many open source companies and founders because they don't know enough about who's there in their community and how can they add value to them. So what would you advise like early stage teams and how can they unpack this black box with the available metrics, with the available information that they have from GitHub, Twitter, Slack, Discourse, all the channels that they are looking at?
It's a great question. Actually, I want to build on what Jason said. It's one of those things you have to be really intentional about. Like community engagement isn't something that happens casually. It's one of those things you really have to be intentional about it, and you have to allocate time and resources. It takes time. It isn't, and you really have to be thoughtful about it. Who is my community? What do I want? What value do I want them to take away from my product, the work that I'm doing, but also what do I want from them in return? Like, because a communication should be two ways, and it should be all about really just understanding the expectations on both sides. And that's, for many companies, it's a hard balance to strike because Jason just named off a couple of really well-known communities, and there's an expectation that all communities are just going to merge fully formed and it's going to be perfect and it's going to be great. And what they don't realize, Linux is a great example. Linux has been around for 27 years? I don't know, time has no meaning for me anymore. But that's been a community that has been decades in the making, decades. And there's a lot of strong opinions in that community, particularly the kernel community. But at the end of the day, it took time, it took engagement. And the same with all of these other communities is they don't just happen overnight. It isn't accidental. There is a lot of people engaged in that community, engaged in both the output, but also what do we want to get out of it and how do we want to participate? And I think, and I'm harping on that just a little bit because I do feel like a lot of companies and that I advise that go down this path don't understand the involvement that takes and how much time that actually takes. It isn't something that's free, cheap, or fast.
Great points, Abby, and couldn't agree enough. I think a lot of companies think of that as funnels versus like creating value first, understanding what are the different segments to create value, and then if it makes sense, find those use cases that people are like looking for and can potentially pay for. And I think the organizations will eventually end up paying for it if the users themselves are seeing value from those products and tools itself. Justin, on that point, just before we end this topic around communities, I'm curious, how did you gather insights in the early days regarding Presto, its community members, its users, its committers, and so on?
Gather insights on how to create like an enterprise product, or sorry, just want to make sure I understand that.
In terms of who's using it, like what are the kind of people using it? What are the segments using it? What are they using it for? What are the use cases? How do you create value for them and so on? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think for us, again, it was a lot of those in-person meetings that we did back then, meetups and so forth, and talking to those early adopters and understanding from them how they were deploying it. And I think that was, or was and is, part of the beauty of the community and running community-driven events is you get to basically sit back and listen to how people are using your stuff, and you learn a lot from them on that. And I think, in the case of Presto, for example, there are a lot of people that want to just query a data lake. Other people want to do federation, and like those are totally different use cases, but they're both interesting, and we kind of learn from people doing each of those.
Switching gears a bit, and I'd love to talk a bit about like open source business models as well, because people who've been empathetic, created value, they themselves obviously want to figure out how to create a commercial model around this value as well. And let's start with Jason this time. Jason, under your leadership at GitHub, you chose not to go into and build CI or continuous integration for a long time, but then went directly to deploy and workflows. And this is obviously a great example of understanding user needs while balancing strategic choices for yourself. Similarly, open source companies need to understand user needs. They also need to make choices and decisions regarding launching enterprise features at the right time. once their community reaches an inflection point based on size, based on engagement, and all those kinds of things. What is your process of thinking through inflection points and prioritization of like these features, and how should like early companies think about it? Because obviously the decision to not go behind the CI route was very beneficial in the longer term.
Sure. So specific to the CI one it was a point in time decision for us. In the fullness of time, we were always going to go down a CI path where we had some solution that looked like a build and deploy mechanism to us. Though as a venture-backed startup, the cogs just weren't there for us with what we were going to build at the time. And it was actually quite frustrating for the community of people who wanted to use GitHub, in that it felt like an obvious next step for us, except there was no material way that we could have supported it with where our revenue projections, what we wanted our financials to look like at the time. We could have made a different decision and raised a lot more money and gone down a path that looked like that, but that wasn't what we really wanted to do. So what we had to do instead was think differently about the problem set, which is, we're developers too, obviously, and what developers actually need to do on a day in, day out basis. And so, we took a different look at that, and we said, the CI feels like it's a very natural progression from where our current product offering is. But what if we gave them a lot more, but slightly less rigorous versions of what they would be expecting in that, and gave them just enough to do certain aspects of things, but maybe not very specific and bespoke versions of that. They would have to go somewhere else to do that. Obviously, that turned out well for us in the decision making at the time that we did that. But how we typically approach that conversation is, it's no different than you would expect in any large corporation. We're doing trade-off analysis. We're trying to figure out how many customers actually need this versus how many just want this. Is it a hard requirement? Is it a soft ask? We're trying to figure out if this is something that can be used across different industries. If we want, there was a point in time when we couldn't release something for the financial market because it would have changed our dynamic too much internally with compliance around that one specific thing. That was about 4 years ago. Now, obviously, we do it, but it was too much for us at one point, and we had to delay doing that to a different point in time. I don't have a magic bullet on this one when it comes to how you think about this, except that, is it right for you at the time? Have some conviction around it. You might be wrong. How fast can you correct that decision? Either if you make one positively to go in the direction or negatively to delay it, you should understand how to understand if you're correct or not, which is, I think, actually more important than making the decision too. You should make it quick, but also understand how you can course correct if you're wrong.
Makes a lot of sense, and making decisions fast and like course correcting as quickly as possible, like being nimble enough to do that, I think is really important. I think that goes back to how you structure your teams and how your teams kind of work together within the organization. I think linked to that is also like when you're thinking of commercializing, you often tend to kind of not balance what you're doing with your open source software as well as what you're doing with like the enterprise features that you're building. And Abby, one of the questions that founders often talk about is how do you decide how to prioritize R&D in open source so that you're still continuing to build more useful features for open source user adoption beyond like building like managed features that companies and enterprises and organizations can pay for. How should companies think about that kind of a balance?
It's one of the hardest things to balance when you have an open core product, honestly, because that value line that customers are willing to pay for changes so quickly. And so, what worked this year around what went into open source and what went into proprietary isn't going to work next year. And, that's something I know we all struggle. I struggle with it because it's like, okay, well, we have to give enough to the community to remain engaged and remain thoughtful and be very intentional about our community and the work we do there with our open source product. But we also need to make money. And so we have to figure out how to balance that so that we're continuously investing and innovating in the proprietary product to drive value for our customers and value they're going to continue to pay for. Because what you don't want to have as a commercial company is for your longtime paying commercial customers to say, okay, well, that's great. I'm going to go back to the open source because it's free. And you know what, I'm just, the extra features aren't enough for me to want to pay for. And that's really where you really have to have a lot of hard conversations around, okay, what's going into open source? What's going into commercial? Why? How are we making those decisions? And what are our strategy and what are the frameworks around those decisions so that the entire team is informed around that direction? Because it's a hard things to balance, which is also when startups ask me and say, I'm going to open source something, that's the first thing I say is that this is really hard.
Yeah. Justin, moving over to you, in our past conversations, you've mentioned that you started off with like a managed support version of Presto with managed support contracts, but then evolved into different open source business models over time. How did you learn what were users willing to pay for, and related to that, like how did you decide that the managed features like connectors that you have today or security features, whether it would be in a SaaS format or should it be in like a support format or should it be like in any other enterprise format? What was the decision-making process over there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're, as a company, we're only 3 years old, but I feel like through those 3 years, we quickly moved through every generation of open source business model, and for deliberate reasons. So we started as a kind of pure support model because we didn't have any proprietary IP. So we had to start that way because we wanted to bootstrap the business to get it off the ground. So that was kind of out of necessity. But I think we quickly realized that support itself was not going to be a strong enough value proposition for a lot of customers, especially early adopters who were already using it and didn't necessarily need our help in many cases. Mm-hmm. So that was the motivation to kind of evolve to an open core model where we created extra features around that open core. And I 100% agree with what Abby's saying. That's one of the hardest decisions, I think, as an open source company is that line of what goes where. And I'll maybe add just one other dimension to it that we also wrestle with, which is some features may actually be developed by the community itself. So you don't have a choice in some cases, right? So even your own proprietary value can be commoditized over time. If you have a particularly active community, and certainly we do with Presto that way. So anyways, I think the third iteration, if you will, and the third generation maybe of open source business model is really a SaaS solution. And when you do that, you're now adding a different angle to the value proposition, which is just convenience. Like you're just making their life easy, and that has value in and of itself. And in fact, I think you can maybe even become a little bit more generous with respect to what you put into the community at that point, because your value is not tied specifically to features as much. It's more the overall platform that you built. So I think, in our space, at least Databricks has been a great example of that, or even Mongo's journey over time. Those are great role models for kind of where we want to go.
Got it. So support to open core to SaaS, that was kind of the progression. And when you think of that progression, I can't help but ask this question from one of our audience members, that when you think of SaaS as kind of a third version or an avatar, you're also obviously thinking about what public cloud companies are doing in that same arena. So how are you kind of working with cloud vendors, and how are you kind of competing with them when you're thinking of a SaaS version of your product?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I imagine that we probably all wrestle with that in some way. I mean, I think, it's co-opetition is the way I would describe it. I mean, I think on some level, we're selling compute, so that's good for them, right? They're getting more compute. So you could think of us as a compute reseller with respect to that dimension of the partnership. But at the same time, they all have product organizations that are taking the same software we build and just making it available, and then dropping the price as low as possible. So it's complicated. I think it forces us to consistently be creating enough value that is independent of what they have access to. And I think, fortunately, at least in our case, AWS has not decided to devote enough resources to really seriously compete. It's more so just taking what we do and making it available.
Wait for reInvent 2021 for that.
Exactly.
Just poke the bear. Yeah.
Sounds great. Thank you for those thoughts. Let's also chat a bit about go-to-market in terms of how do you think of building teams, and how do you think of like pricing and all those aspects as well? Because that's obviously core of everything in terms of executing that business. And many times founders underestimate the how difficult is it to build sales and marketing teams and organizations. Did you have any thoughts or advice on how you should build your go-to-market teams from marketing, sales, developer advocacy, and what should be the order of hiring those people and leaders within each of those functions as you move from like a seed stage company to a Series A company? And everyone has a different definition of seed and A, but and I think Justin, you went directly to an A, but would still love to get thoughts. Maybe we can start with Jason for this question, and then we can go around, because I'd love to get everyone's thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's pretty easy because GitHub's seed stage was $100 million on a $1.5 billion post, so pretty straightforward for the day. I think that open source isn't the actual angle when I think about go-to-market necessarily being any differentiated, types of motions. But what I do think about is I think about tops-down, bottoms-up adoption more than I actually think about open source here, for what it's worth. So when I think about tops-down, obviously I think about what type of company you're going to become if you start tops-down selling out of the gate, with the seed or A or whatever. And if that's appropriate for your business, by all means, go ahead. But if it's not, then it could change your company overnight. Bottoms-up selling or bottoms-up adoption has its own other wrinkles, but it's pretty adaptable to developer-focused markets these days, and it's actually how most software gets bought these days, is from bottoms up, and it kind of works its way throughout the organization. So I don't necessarily bucket any go-to-market under open source. I just think about those two motions. Now, I'll say one thing about bottoms up, because it is top of mind for a lot of people getting developers or other people to adopt your software. Because there's a couple of things that I do think about here. Is one, understand that there's pretty well-established path to bottoms-up motions, which is an individual inside an organization brings it to their team, which brings it to their department, which brings it to the company. If you kind of start in the middle there, like, hey, we're going to sell the teams bottoms up, it's almost a mixed message, because selling to the team sort of is a little bit of a half bottoms up, half tops down. Just understand that. So the easiest way that I think about this is an individual is going to bring it to their team. Once they bring it to the team, it's going to probably change the types of features you want to offer, collaboration or some sort of virality nature, that sort of thing. If it brings it at a department level, you're going to have more things you're going to need. All of a sudden, you're looking more like enterprise anyway. You're going to have checkboxes. You're going to likely have SOC 2 or FedRAMP or other things. More people are going to get involved in the buying process there. So somewhere from an individual to the department, you're likely going to introduce top-down selling if you're a bottoms-up company.
Super helpful. Abby, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, Jason did a great job. I mean, once you start top down, it's a whole different sales motion, and it's a whole different opportunity. But also in enterprise, as you expand your footprint, you're going to have to move up the stack. You're going to have to move up in terms of who the buyer is, because what that is an indicator of is bigger contract, bigger value, bigger sales. Now, the ramifications that are longer sales cycles, and it takes a lot more time, and there's a lot more building that business outcome, those values associated with it. But at the end of the day, there isn't, particularly when it comes to open source or open core products, there aren't any quick tricks you can take. It's all pretty common in the way we're all selling software today, which is, who's your target demographic, who's the user, who's the buyer, and then applying the go-to-market appropriate to those two demographics. And I say two because for many of us, the user and the buyer are not the same person. And so just really understanding that in the way that we market and sell, and then also how do we, from a back office standpoint, how do we support that in the way that we price and package things too? I think Jason hit on a good point. If you're going after a team, what behavior do you want, and how are you packaging and pricing your software accordingly? And that also has a lot to play in terms of who your buyer is and how they're going to use the software.
Yep, absolutely. And just to obviously hear all these aspects from the point of view of a company, Justin, could you talk a bit about how did you go about the bottom up and the top down motion for Starburst, and what were the hires in order of head of marketing, head of sales, and so on? And what was the buying pattern like?
Sure. So I'll just add the one piece of color that we started again as a bootstrap business. So by virtue of that, like we started as a bunch of engineers. I was the only one, I guess, selling in the early days, and then kind of grew organically from there. And I think by virtue of that, like the only way that was possible was because of the bottoms up aspect of it, that people were downloading and using the software and coming to us, and that made that possible for the first couple of years of the business. So I would say like invest in that side of things first would be my instinct, because I think you want to get that right. And also I'll say, the top down is much more expensive. That's where you kind of have to raise venture, because these salespeople are not productive on day one, right? So you have to kind of fund that investment before you see the return. And that's really the story of our third year, quite frankly. And that's why we've raised now at this point.
Justin brought up something I would like to emphasize here, which I talk about sometimes too, which is if you go tops down early, it might change your company and product in a way that is unnatural to you, that you don't have with a bottoms up motion, which is a direct relationship with the user typically. So imagine that you're building a awesome product, but the next thing you know, you spent the next 2.5 years basically doing checkbox type stuff for compliance reasons. You could have a lot of initial sales success, but you actually don't know if your product is going to fully stick with the customers and provide a lot of value. You don't get this type of immediate response you get from a bottoms up motion. I found that to be kind of a poignant insight when it dawned on me one day. I was like, oh, this is a direct relationship as opposed to an indirect relationship with my user.
It's a great point.
Great point and super insightful. Yeah. And I know that we can talk about this for like hours and hours, but I know that we need to wrap up the conversation. So I have like one last question for each of you, and I'll take some questions from the audience as well as a part of, I can kind of mix and match my questions with that. So for Jason, this question is for you, and this is for all the founders, users of open source in our audience today, and I'm sure they are closely listening to this question. Which new development tool categories or even specific companies are you and your GitHub team most excited about at this point in time?
Ridiculously hard question, because there's so many interesting things that are happening. I do think the entire Jamstack space is just fascinating to me, because I think that it's kind of reinventing a lot of stuff that we did last 20 years over in a new category. Companies like Fastly and Cloudflare are basically redefining infrastructure on the fly, and I don't think any of the three big clouds really understand what's going to happen there just yet, and those two will probably own that category. Serverless in the functions world is very, very interesting, but it's also one of the worst developer experience places on the entire internet. And it's just awful to use any serverless functions type of product from one of the three major clouds, and I work for one of those. And then there are a lot of new databases coming out, a lot of new databases and new ways to engage with data. You've got people they're doing streaming databases. You got people that are doing basically a take on Kafka or connectors or other things in front of the data stores. You've got, I have a bunch of friends now over at PlanetScale, not to use the name of one company here, but they're trying to bring global scalability to the MySQL world in a way that was spun out of some large companies. I don't know, it feels like everything is being reinvented again on the fly, and there's nothing not to be fascinated about. I mean, we even have programming language innovation again for the first time in a while with, Rust is going to take off. It's very clear it's going to take off at the system language level. And WebAssembly is something I'm just like personally incredibly fascinated by.
Awesome categories. And does the announcements around Lambda supporting Docker images at reInvent change your perspective on serverless at all from a cloud?
No, I'm actually very, very bullish on serverless. I think that's a fascinating product line. I think it's amazing what you can do with it. I just think that it's nascent DX. I mean, it's just what you're expecting. Just take Netlify as an example in the Jamstack world versus what you're doing in the serverless, and you'll basically feel like the 1950s versus the 2020s essentially. And I think that's a magnanimous view of serverless at the moment, which is just not there. But there are companies that are trying to do it. You've got a company called Begin that's trying to do it out of Arc. You've got a company called, I think Serverless itself is a company these days that's trying to do it. I mean, there's a lot of people that are trying to do it. The problem with it is it's not across all three clouds right now. So again, it's a little bit of a bet at the moment.
Sounds awesome. Abby, one last question for you. You've written about the shared accountability of the consumers of open source as well. For kind of continued participation, there are people who are consuming open source but not actively contributing back. But obviously, people are busy with like limited resources, limited time. How should like users within like bigger organizations and enterprises think about like contributing back so that there's a shared accountability of growing open source overall?
Yeah, I mean, the tragedy of commons is a real thing in open source, particularly when the shine wears off, because everyone likes to get involved early on when it's cool and interesting. But when you have to borrow an open source phrase, chop wood and carry water, all of a sudden you get a lot less volunteers to do the work. And so it is meaningful though for organizations that consume in large quantities to give back, because at the end of the day, it's those contributions, particularly those that do the work that's not often seen on the front lines, the security, the patching, maintenance, updates, things like that happen behind the scenes on a lot of the core of the products that are the most important and the most critical. And honestly, I do feel like, and I could get on a really big soapbox about this one, because if we look at where the future of enterprise infrastructure is going, it's all going to be based. So it's all based on open source. All of the new innovation we're doing is starting with open source. And at the end of the day, if we're as a collective industry not contributing back to that work, that are particularly those of us that are using it at scale, that means we're building all of these future systems and platforms on a pretty fragile system, because that means who's maintaining it. And so I feel like the tragedy of commons with open source is so much more front and center, particularly as we're running more and more critical systems on open source projects. And a lot of companies are not contributing back to the maintenance of those. And that's my, I'll stop my rant right there. But I feel like we're all betting the farm on these things. We should have a vested interest in whether or not they're stable.
It's a clear message to all the people who are using open source, and that was my intention to ask this question as well. Justin, one last question for you. With so much open source activity, and you've obviously spoken about optionality a lot in the past, where people have the optionality, people have like so much to kind of choose from now compared to what they had like a few years back. How should any new entrepreneur who's starting with an open source model think about breaking through the noise and creating real value for their users?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I mean, I think I'll maybe touch on a couple other things that were said over the course of this session, like, really know your customer, know your end user, and make sure that you're building something useful to them. And also try to find a lighthouse user early on, user or users. I think that's why you see so many of these technologies come out of LinkedIn or Facebook or what have you, is you've kind of got a built-in lighthouse, right? That's like, wow, okay, they use this, it works. I want to be like them. You kind of get this really good start to your project, I think, that way.
Got it. Thank you so much. That ends our panel for today, and I'm super grateful for all of you to kind of be a part of the panel, provide insights, and thank you to Abby, Jason, and Justin for joining us today and sharing your experiences and insights with all of us. And for the audience, don't miss our final session of the day. My partner, Ashu, speaks with execs from Microsoft and PayPal about enterprises moving to the cloud and how that transition has been affected by COVID. Like years of transformation kind of compressed in like few months now. But thank you so much, all of you.